The grand ballroom of the luxury hotel was an exercise in corporate excess, a gilded monument to the ego of Charles Vance and the shareholders who blindly supported his regime. The walls were lined with heavy gold leaf molding, and massive crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling like frozen rain, casting a harsh, fragmented glare over the wealthy crowd below. Underneath those sparkling lights, the rigid social hierarchy of Vance Capital was laid bare for anyone who cared to look. On one side of the marble room, the senior partners, investment bankers, and board members stood in tight, exclusive circles. They clinked their glasses of vintage champagne and talked in hushed, serious tones about market capitalizations, leveraged buyouts, and tax shelters. On the other side of the room, near the exits, the administrative assistants, IT technicians, and junior analysts huddled together. They held cheap drinks, checked their watches, and counted down the minutes until they could slip away without appearing disloyal. I belonged to neither group. I was a man of the shadows, a corporate ghost, who existed only in the margins of their spreadsheets and the footnotes of their quarterly audits. For 8 long years, I had occupied a windowless cubicle in the back corner of the compliance department, surrounded by stacks of paper risk assessments and dual monitors that burned my eyes with the cold blue glare of risk matrices. While the front office brokers and marketing directors took credit for every successful deal, it was my job to make sure those deals did not violate federal security regulations or trigger a catastrophic compliance lawsuit. I was the safety net they never thought about until they were falling. And yet, to the people in this room, I was nothing more than Gary from Risk, a quiet, middle-aged man who wore off the rack gray blazers and drove a 10-year-old sedan. I was a line-item expense, a necessary annoyance, rather than the senior analyst who had spent his career keeping the firm from running directly into a wall. The lighting in the room was intentionally dim, designed to soften the sharp edges of aging faces and the harsh reality of our balance sheets. Vance Capital was a firm built on appearances, and Charles Vance had spent millions of dollars of shareholder money to ensure that the appearance was always one of supreme wealth and stability. He had hired the most expensive interior designers to furnish the executive suites, and he had filled the lobby with art pieces that looked impressive but held little actual value. It was a theme that ran through the entire organization. The brokers who made the most noise were the ones who brought in the least net revenue, while the quiet analysts in the basement were the ones who kept the firm solvent. I had spent 8 years observing this dynamic, watching as incompetent managers were promoted for their golf handicaps while dedicated compliance officers were laid off during corporate restructuring phases. I had survived 3 rounds of layoffs, simply because the legal department knew that if they let me go, they would have no one who understood the filing codes for our patent portfolio. I was the institutional memory of the firm, the only person who remembered why we had structured certain deals the way we did, and yet, I was paid less than the junior associates, who spent their days scheduling client dinners and writing reports that were filled with grammatical errors and fabricated projections. I had written the risk guidelines that saved our skin during the previous year's security scare. I had flagged the anomalies that no one else had the patience to track down. But tonight, I was just a ghost at the feast. Sabrina Vance, the CEO's 26-year-old daughter, was the center of attention. She had been given the title of head of corporate events and relations not because she had any experience, but because her father wanted to keep her on the payroll while she figured out what she wanted to do with her life. She spent her days booking overpriced catering services, hiring luxury travel agencies, and organizing elaborate events like this fundraiser, billing the astronomical cost to the company's marketing budget. She had a team of 3 dedicated assistants who did all the actual work, leaving her free to spend her time socializing with investors and posting pictures of her lavish lifestyle on social media. She treated the office like her personal playground, and she treated the employees like her personal staff. I had seen her order senior analysts to fetch her lunch, and I had seen her laugh at secretaries who did not move out of her way fast enough in the hallways. She was a bully, but she was a bully with the full backing of the chief executive officer himself. The charity fundraiser was supposed to be a celebration, of our annual performance, but it had quickly devolved into a display of arrogance and superficial charity. The tickets to the event cost $500 each, and the auction items included luxury ski trips and private dinners with famous chefs, all of which would be written off as corporate expenses by the wealthy bidders. The money raised would go to a foundation that was chaired by Charles Vance's wife, a circular arrangement that did more to reduce the family's tax liability than it did to help the community. I stood near the catering table, watching the hypocrisy unfold when Sabrina walked onto the stage. She was already tipsy, her laughter a little too loud as she grabbed the microphone from the older auctioneer. She wanted a show, and she had decided that I would be the main event. "We need to make this night interesting," she slurred into the microphone, her voice echoing off the high, gilded ceilings. The crowd cheered, mostly because they were drunk and looking for entertainment. Sabrina scanned the room, her eyes locking onto me with a cold, mocking gaze. "How about we auction off our most boring analyst? Come on, Gary from Risk, let's put you on the block. It is all for charity. Let's see who wants to buy a man who spends 12 hours a day staring at spreadsheet formulas." Before I could move or turn away, a blinding white spotlight swept across the room and landed directly on me. The heat of the light felt like it was peeling my skin off. 180 people turned to look at me, their faces illuminated by the reflection of the light. I could hear the whispers, the quiet chuckles, the awkward coughing of the board members who knew it was wrong but did not want to stop the boss's daughter. Sabrina laughed into the microphone, telling the crowd that I was the guy who once flagged a decimal point error in a risk matrix like it was national security, and that the highest bidder was guaranteed to have their taxes kept in order. No one bid, not because they respected my work, but because they did not want to make the cruelty of her public joke real. I stood in the spotlight, frozen, wishing the marble floor would split open and swallow me whole. In the back of the room, near the catering tables, I saw a man in a dark charcoal suit. He was not laughing. He was not looking at his phone. He was just watching me with a cold, calculating intensity that made my spine tingle. When the spotlight finally moved away to another part of the room, I walked to the bathroom, locked myself in the last stall, and pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking, but my mind was perfectly clear. I opened an encrypted messaging app, found a contact named Grant Mercer, and typed 3 simple words: "It is time." 10 seconds later, the reply came back: "Always." I sat on the closed lid of the toilet in that quiet bathroom, staring at that single word on my glowing screen. Always. It was the release valve on 18 months of silent, meticulous preparation. To understand how a senior risk analyst ends up plotting the hostile takeover of a multi-million-dollar financial firm, you have to understand the math. And the math at Vance Capital had been broken for a very long time. 18 months ago, an assistant under Sabrina's direct supervision had misclassified a major municipal bond portfolio in a compliance report. It was a simple decimal point error, but it made a low-risk asset pool look like a toxic debt bomb that could destroy the firm. The report was already on its way to our primary institutional investors when I caught it on a Sunday night, long after everyone else had logged off. I did not call Sabrina, and I did not notify her father, Charles Vance. I knew exactly what they would do: cover it up, blame a random intern, and completely ignore the underlying systemic failure. Instead, I quietly corrected the data, ran a full independent audit, and forwarded the clean report to the investor's representative with a brief professional note detailing the correction. That investor was Grant Mercer. Grant Mercer ran a private equity firm that was so quiet and so powerful that even the big banks spoke of him in whispers. 2 days after I sent that corrected report, I received a message on a secure channel. It simply stated that Mr. Mercer appreciated my discretion and wanted to meet in person. We met at the Conrad, a luxury hotel just 2 blocks from our headquarters. The lobby smelled of expensive mahogany, leather, and quiet power. Grant sat in a corner booth, wearing a navy blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, exposing forearms covered in old military tattoos. He did not look like a typical corporate raider, but his eyes had the sharp, hungry look of a hawk. "You have a very interesting definition of compliance, Gary," he had said to me, taking a slow sip of his black coffee. "I am just doing my job, Mr. Mercer," I replied. "The numbers do not lie. People do, but the numbers are always honest. He had smiled then, a small, dangerous movement of his lips. He showed me a file on his tablet. It was a detailed breakdown of Vance Capital's outstanding shares, voting rights, and debt obligations. The strategy we had developed was not a simple corporate raid. It was a slow, legal squeeze. Grant Mercer did not want a public battle that would damage the firm's reputation and decrease the value of its assets. He wanted a clean, silent transition of power, one that would leave the clients reassured and the employees focused on their work. To do that, he needed more than just a majority of the shares. He needed the compliance logs and the audit records that would give him the leverage to force Charles Vance to step down without a fight. For 18 months, I had spent my nights downloading archived transaction records, extracting metadata from Sabrina's expense accounts, and cataloging every instance of corporate funds being used for personal gain. It was exhausting work, done in the quiet hours after the building had cleared out, when the only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the distant cleaning crew. I knew that if I was caught, I would be prosecuted under corporate espionage laws. But I also knew that the risk was worth the reward. I was not just building a case for Grant Mercer. I was building my own future. Grant had been quietly buying up minority stakes in the company for over a year, working through shell companies and secondary markets. He was looking for a wedge, a way to force Charles Vance out and restructure the firm from the ground up. He wanted to purge the incompetence and build a business that was based on real value, not family connections and marketing fluff. "I want to buy this company, Gary," he had said flatly, "but I do not buy black boxes. I need to know where the bodies are buried." I knew where every single one was. For the last 8 years, I had kept a detailed personal ledger of every compliance violation, every questionable tax write-off, and every breach of fiduciary duty committed by Charles Vance and his daughter. I had kept it as insurance, a shield against the day they inevitably decided to scapegoat the risk department for their own mistakes. But sitting across from Grant Mercer, I realized it was not a shield. It was a sword. "I can give you the blueprint," I told him, "but it is going to cost you." "I do not mind paying for quality," Grant said. "What do you want?" "I want them to see me," I said. "I want them to know exactly who took their toys away." Now, standing in the bathroom of the ballroom, the memory of that promise gave me a strange, cold peace. The humiliation of Sabrina's public auction was still burning in my chest, but it was a useful fire. I washed my face, straightened my tie, and walked back out into the crowd. I even smiled at the human resources director, Mr. Jenkins, who patted my shoulder and told me I was a great team player for laughing along with Sabrina's little joke. I agreed with him. I was a wonderful team player. I was just playing for a different team now. The game had officially changed, and they did not even know the board had been reset. By Monday morning, the trap was set, and the first gears of the machine began to grind. It started with a series of formal inquiries from 2 of our largest institutional investors, both of whom were secretly controlled by Grant Mercer's holding company. The questions were highly technical, focused on discrepancies between our Q2 and Q3 financial forecasts. These were not the kind of questions that could be brushed off with a glossy newsletter or a lunch meeting. They wanted raw data, and they wanted it by the end of the week. Sabrina Vance was in a state of controlled panic. I could hear her heels clicking back and forth in her office all morning, her voice rising as she argued with her father. By noon, she had called an emergency meeting of the risk and compliance team. "This is just a routine check," she told us, her voice tight and strained, though she tried to maintain her usual air of superiority. "We need to package the data and send it back immediately. Gary, I want you to coordinate the reports." I nodded, keeping my expression completely blank. "Of course, Sabrina, I will get right on it." But Sabrina had another surprise for me. The door to the conference room opened, and she introduced a young woman with an expensive haircut and a brand new business degree. "This is Brittany Coles," Sabrina announced. "She is joining us as the new Vice President of Strategic Initiatives. She will be overseeing the final data package. Gary, I need you to get her up to speed on our internal systems and databases." Brittany Cole's office was located right next to Sabrina's, A prime piece of corporate real estate that had been vacated by a senior analyst who had actually contributed to our quarterly revenue. Brittany spent her first week decorating the space with motivational books she had never read and framed pictures of her summer trips to Europe. She was more interested in the aesthetics of her position than the responsibilities, and she spent hours discussing the new office layout with the facilities manager while our compliance backlogs continued to grow. Every time I met with her in the conference room, I had to suppress my frustration. She would print out my spreadsheets on heavy, expensive paper, color code them with highlighters, and then ask me to explain what the columns meant. She did not know the difference between a debt ratio and an asset evaluation, and she kept referring to the risk department as the compliance vibe team. It was clear that she had been hired to serve as Sabrina's personal assistant and buffer, a way for Sabrina to avoid doing any actual work, while still claiming credit for the department's operations. I let her play her game, knowing that every spreadsheet she highlighted was bringing us one step closer to the end. Brittany was Sabrina's former sorority sister, a woman whose entire financial experience consisted of managing her personal allowance. She sat across from me, looking at our database as if it were written in ancient hieroglyphics. She spoke in a stream of meaningless corporate buzzwords, talking about synergy and paradigm shifts, while completely failing to understand the basic mechanics of cash flow. I smiled and agreed with everything she said. I was the helpful, patient veteran. I set up a training schedule for her, giving her access to a specific set of staging databases. What Brittany did not know, and what Sabrina was too lazy to check, was that these databases had been loaded with tracking codes. Every spreadsheet Brittany modified, every document she downloaded, and every query she ran was logged and sent directly to my private server, which was linked to Grant Mercer's legal team. I spent 3 days teaching Brittany how to run risk reports, gently steering her toward the files that contained Sabrina's personal expense accounts. Brittany, eager to show her boss's daughter how efficient she was, began consolidating the files into a master report. She did not realize she was compiling the very evidence that would destroy her friend. She spent hours copying data, thinking she was performing high-level analysis, while actually serving as the perfect, unwitting courier of her own team's corruption. Sabrina dropped by our workspace on Wednesday afternoon, looking stressed but still finding time to make a dig. "Still working on those spreadsheets, Gary?" she asked, leaning against my cubicle wall. "I guess some people are just built for the details while others are built for leadership." "We all have our role to play, Sabrina," I said, looking up from my screen with a calm expression. "Exactly." She laughed, turning to Brittany. "Make sure he does not make the numbers too boring, Brittany. We want this presentation to shine." I watched them walk away, their laughter echoing down the hallway. I looked back at my monitor, where a progress bar was showing the upload of the master expense file to Grant's team. The transfer was completed at 3:15 in the afternoon. The match had been struck, and the building was already filled with gas. They were just too busy laughing to smell the fumes. On Thursday morning, the fire officially reached the executive offices. The audit requests from Grant's team were no longer polite inquiries. They were formal demands, backed by the threat of a shareholder lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty under Delaware corporate law. They wanted a full, itemized accounting of Sabrina's travel and entertainment expenditures for the last 2 years, including all receipts, vendor invoices, and authorization forms. The office was in complete chaos. Charles Vance's shouting could be heard through the double doors of his executive suite. He was demanding to know how the investors had obtained such specific details about Sabrina's personal trips, including a luxury retreat in Dubai that had been billed as a marketing seminar. I was at my desk, finishing a routine compliance report, when Mr. Jenkins, the Human Resources Director, and Brenda, the Senior Employee Relations Representative, walked into my cubicle. Their faces were tense, their usual forced smiles completely gone. "Gary, we need to speak in conference room B," immediately Mr. Jenkins said, his voice flat and cold. Conference room B was where they took people before they escorted them out of the building. I stood up, took my phone, and followed them down the quiet hallway. Once the door was closed, Brenda sat down and folded her hands on the table. Gary, we have been reviewing your recent activity on the internal network, she began, her voice dripping with artificial concern. There are records of you accessing sensitive executive files that are outside your department's scope. I sat back, calm. I had anticipated this move. I am the senior risk analyst, I replied. My job description explicitly grants me access to all financial ledgers to perform compliance reviews. This goes beyond routine reviews, Mr. Jenkins interrupted, leaning forward. The board is very concerned about a potential leak of proprietary information. We believe you have been sharing data with external parties. This is a serious violation of your employment agreement. We are looking at immediate termination for cause. I looked at the two of them. They were small people, middle managers trying to protect the people who paid their salaries, completely blind to the fact that the company was already sinking. If you terminate me, I said quietly, you will be violating federal whistleblower protection laws under 18 United States Code, Section 1514A, as well as state regulations regarding the reporting of corporate fraud. Brenda scoffed. Gary, you do not have any evidence of fraud. Actually, I do, I said. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small black voice recorder, and placed it on the table. It was already recording, and I also have documented proof that Sabrina Vance forged vendor invoices to cover her personal expenditures, which is a direct violation of California Penal Code, Section 470. I have uploaded those records to an external legal firm, along with a full recording of our conversation today. The HR department at Vance Capital had never been about protecting the employees. It was a defense mechanism for the executive team, a department whose sole purpose was to minimize the firm's liability and silence any complaints. I had seen them bury reports of harassment, ignore compliance violations, and terminate whistleblowers under the guise of performance issues. They believed they were untouchable, protected by the legal team and the CEO's personal influence. They did not expect an employee to come prepared with federal statutes and encrypted recordings. As I sat in that cold conference room, looking at Mr. Jenkins's pale face, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. For years, I had watched them use these exact same intimidation tactics on younger analysts, forcing them to sign non-disclosure agreements and accept unfair severance packages. They had tried to do the same to me, believing that my quiet demeanor meant I was weak. They had forgotten that in the world of compliance, the quiet ones are the ones who hold all the data. Mr. Jenkins went pale. His eyes darted to the recorder, then back to my face. I suggest you think very carefully about your next steps, I continued, my voice steady and quiet. If I am locked out of my computer, or if my employment status changes in any way, those documents will be sent directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the major financial press. The room went dead silent. Brenda opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Mr. Jenkins just stared at the table, his forehead glistening with sweat. I stood up, leaving the recorder on the table. I have some work to finish, I said. Have a good afternoon. I walked back to my desk. No one stopped me. No one touched my computer. The shield had held, and the sword was about to strike. The final winter fundraiser was held in the same grand ballroom, but the atmosphere was completely different. The air was thick with tension, and the executives from Vance Capital moved through the room like they were walking through a minefield. Sabrina Vance was there, wearing a glittering silver dress that looked like armor. She was drinking heavily, her laugh loud, and desperate as she tried to convince the remaining board members that everything was under control. But she could not hide the twitch in her jaw or the way her eyes darted to the entrance every time the doors opened. At 9 o'clock, Sabrina took the stage, grabbing the microphone from the auctioneer once again. It was a desperate attempt to show she still had power, to prove to the room that she was still in charge. Let's do our favorite event, she slurred into the mic, her eyes scanning the crowd until they found me standing near the back. Who wants to bid on our boring risk analyst tonight? Do I hear $50? A few people laughed nervously, but most of the room stayed silent, sensing the danger. Sabrina's smile faltered, her face tightening with anger. Come on, she shouted. Someone must want him. He is great at finding errors. $1 million, a voice called out from the back. The room went dead silent. The music stopped. Every head turned to see Grant Mercer walking slowly down the center aisle, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He did not look at the stage, he looked only at me. He walked up to the stage, climbed the steps, and took the microphone from Sabrina's limp hand. She stood there, her mouth open, unable to speak. "My name is Grant Mercer," he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the ballroom. "I am the principal investor of Mercer Strategic Holdings. As of 5 o'clock this afternoon, we have acquired a majority stake in Vance Capital. Charles Vance has been removed as chief executive officer by a vote of the board of directors." A collective gasp went through the crowd. "And I want to make one thing very clear," Grant continued, turning to look at me. "I did not buy this company for its leadership. I bought it for its risk department. Gary Miller is the only reason this firm is still standing, and as of tomorrow morning, he is the new special advisor to the board of directors." Sabrina did not drop the microphone. She had already lost it. She took a step back, her heel catching on her dress, and nearly fell before her father caught her arm. They both stood there, frozen, their faces pale under the stage lights, as the crowd began to whisper and turn away from them. The next morning, the boardroom was quiet. I sat at the head of the mahogany table, next to Grant Mercer. Charles and Sabrina Vance were gone, replaced by compliance officers and auditors. Sabrina was currently facing a criminal investigation under California Penal Code Section 470 for the forged expense invoices, and her father was being sued for breach of fiduciary duty. The board meeting was a clean, professional execution. Grant Mercer's legal team had prepared a comprehensive document package that left the board members with no room to negotiate. They had details of every transaction, copies of every forged invoice, and the secure audio files of my meeting with the HR team. The board members, who had spent years ignoring Charles Vance's poor management, were suddenly eager to cooperate, desperate to avoid being named as co-defendants in the shareholder lawsuit that Grant was prepared to file. They voted to remove Charles and Sabrina Vance within 10 minutes, and then spent the next hour discussing how to spin the news to the financial press. They wanted to present the transition as a strategic retirement, a planned restructuring that would position the firm for future growth. I let them write their press releases, knowing that the reality would eventually find its way to the public. The only thing that mattered was that the Vances were gone, and the firm was finally under the control of people who understood the value of real compliance. Mr. Jenkins and Brenda were seated at the far end of the table, their folders open, their pens trembling. "We want to welcome you to your new role, Gary," Mr. Jenkins said, his voice shaking slightly. "We are eager to collaborate." I looked at them, then at my notes. I did not smile. It was not necessary. "We will start with a full audit of the Human Resources Department," I said, my voice quiet and steady. "I want to make sure our company culture is aligned with the new management." They both nodded quickly, eager to please. I sat back in my chair, looking out the window at the city skyline. I was no longer Gary from Risk, the boring analyst in the corner. I was the guy who owned the room,